The year was 1860, and America stood at a crossroads that would define the very soul of the nation. Picture this: a country barely 80 years old, stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, yet torn apart by a question so fundamental it would soon drench the continent in blood. What happens when a house divided against itself can no longer stand? What happens when brothers take up arms against brothers, when fathers face sons across smoky battlefields? When the very idea of what America should be becomes worth dying for? Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, I'm going to take you on a journey through the most defining conflict in American history. The Civil War. 4 years that would claim more American lives than all other wars combined. 4 years that would transform a collection of states into a true nation. 4 years that would finally answer the question that had haunted America since its founding: could a country built on the promise that all men are created equal actually live up to those words? This isn't just a story about generals and battles, though we'll witness the brilliance of Lee and the determination of Grant. This isn't just about politics, though we'll see how a tall, melancholy lawyer from Illinois would guide the nation through its darkest hour. This is the story of ordinary people caught in extraordinary times. The story of enslaved men and women who saw in this conflict their path to freedom. The story of farmers who left their plows to take up rifles. The story of a nation that had to tear itself apart to become whole. What I'm about to share with you tonight spans from the earliest seeds of division planted at America's founding through the compromises that tried to hold the Union together to the election that finally broke it apart. We'll march with Sherman to the sea stand, with Lincoln as he signs the Emancipation Proclamation, and witness the surrender at Appomattox that would end the bloodiest chapter in American history. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. Every single event we're about to explore actually happened. Every battle, every speech, every moment of courage and cowardice shaped the America we know today. The very freedoms we take for granted were forged in the crucible of this conflict. So settle in, close your eyes, and let me transport you to an America on the brink of war. An America where the sound of church bells would soon be replaced by cannon fire, where cotton fields would become battlefields, where the question of human bondage would finally demand an answer written in blood and sacrifice. Our story begins not with the first shot fired at Fort Sumter, but decades earlier with the compromises and contradictions that made war inevitable. To understand how America came to fight itself, we must first understand how a nation founded on liberty could simultaneously embrace slavery. In the beginning, there was the contradiction. When Thomas Jefferson penned those immortal words in 1776, "All men are created equal," he owned over 200 human beings. When the Founding Fathers gathered in Philadelphia to craft a constitution, they wrestled with a question that threatened to tear apart their fragile union before it even began what to do about slavery. The solution they reached was as ingenious as it was morally bankrupt. They would count enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation purposes, giving Southern states more power in Congress while denying those same people any actual rights. They would allow the importation of enslaved people to continue for another 20 years. They would include a fugitive slave clause requiring northern states to return escaped bondsmen to their southern masters. In essence, they kicked the can down the road, hoping future generations would solve what they couldn't. But contradictions have a way of demanding resolution. As America expanded westward, gobbling up vast territories from the Louisiana Purchase to the Mexican Cession, the question arose again and again: would these new lands be slave or free? Each time, political leaders crafted compromises that temporarily eased tensions, while making the eventual reckoning more terrible. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 drew a line across the continent, Slavery permitted south of the 3630s parallel, prohibited north of it. For a generation, this maintained an uneasy balance. But then came Texas, vast and hungry for statehood, threatening to tip the scales toward slavery. The Compromise of 1850 tried once more to paper over the cracks, admitting California as a free state, while strengthening the Fugitive Slave Act and allowing popular sovereignty in the territories. Each compromise satisfied no one completely, while making everyone more entrenched in their positions. Northerners grew increasingly uncomfortable with their complicity in slavery, especially after the Fugitive Slave Act forced them to participate actively in returning escaped bondsmen. Southerners grew increasingly paranoid that the North was plotting to destroy their way of life, their economy, their very identity. The 1850s brought a series of events that pushed the nation closer to the brink. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 opened territories that should have been free under the Missouri Compromise to the possibility of slavery through popular sovereignty. The result was Bleeding Kansas, a preview of the Civil War to come as pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers literally fought for control of the territory. In 1857, the Supreme Court delivered the Dred Scott decision, ruling that Black Americans could never be citizens and that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in the territories. Chief Justice Roger Taney declared that Black people had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. The decision outraged the North and emboldened the South, making compromise even more difficult. Then came John Brown. First in Kansas, where he and his sons hacked pro-slavery settlers to death with broadswords in the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre. Then in 1859, when he seized the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, hoping to spark a slave rebellion that would spread across the South. Brown was captured, tried, and hanged, but his execution only made him a martyr in the North and convinced many Southerners that Yankees were indeed plotting to incite their slaves to rebellion. Into this cauldron of sectional hatred stepped Abraham Lincoln. Tall, gaunt, with deep-set eyes that seemed to carry the weight of the world, Lincoln was not yet the great emancipator of legend. He was a prairie lawyer, a failed shopkeeper, a man who had lost more elections than he had won. But Lincoln possessed something his more polished rivals lacked: an ability to see clearly through to the moral heart of complex issues, and the words to express that clarity in language that ordinary people could understand. Lincoln's rise to national prominence began with his debates against Stephen Douglas during the 1858 Senate race in Illinois. Douglas, the Little Giant, was the champion of popular sovereignty, the idea that each territory should decide for itself whether to allow slavery. Lincoln argued that the nation could not endure permanently half slave and half free, that it must become all one thing or all the other. A house divided against itself cannot stand, he declared, borrowing from Scripture to make his point. Though Lincoln lost that Senate race, the debates made him a national figure and positioned him perfectly for the 1860 presidential election. The Democratic Party, the last truly national political party, split along sectional lines. Northern Democrats nominated Douglas, Southern Democrats nominated John Breckinridge, and Constitutional Unionists nominated John Bell. The Republican Party, founded just 6 years earlier as an explicitly anti-slavery party, nominated Lincoln. Lincoln's nomination terrified the South. Here was a man who had declared that slavery was a moral wrong, who belonged to a party dedicated to preventing its expansion. Never mind that Lincoln had repeatedly stated he would not interfere with slavery where it already existed. Never mind that he had no constitutional power to do so even if he wanted to. The South saw in Lincoln's election the beginning of the end of their way of life. The campaign of 1860 was unlike any in American history. Lincoln's name didn't even appear on the ballot in most Southern states. Douglas campaigned desperately to hold the Union together, warning that Lincoln's election would mean secession and war. Breckinridge represented the Southern position that any interference with slavery was grounds for leaving the Union. Bell hoped that appeals to patriotism and memories of the Founding Fathers might yet save the country. On November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States with less than 40% of the popular vote. He carried every northern state except New Jersey, giving him a comfortable majority in the Electoral College. But his victory was entirely sectional. He received virtually no votes in the South, proving that America had become two countries sharing one government. The South's response was swift and decisive. South Carolina, the most radical of the Southern states, called a secession convention within days of Lincoln's election. On December 20, 1860, delegates unanimously voted to secede from the Union, declaring that the Union now subsisting between South Carolina and other states under the name of the United States of America is hereby dissolved. The secession document made clear that slavery was the central issue. South Carolina complained that northern states had assumed the right of deciding upon the propriety of our domestic institutions and had encouraged and assisted thousands of our slaves to leave their homes. They could not remain in a union where their property rights and human beings were not respected. Other states quickly followed. Mississippi seceded on January 9, 1861, declaring that their position was thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. Florida followed on January 10, Alabama on January 11, Georgia on January 19, Louisiana on January 26, and Texas on February 1. By the time Lincoln took office, 7 states had left the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. Meanwhile, in Washington, the lame duck administration of James Buchanan floundered helplessly. Buchanan, a Pennsylvania Democrat who had spent his career appeasing the South, declared secession illegal, but claimed he had no power to stop it. As federal forts and arsenals throughout the South were seized by state forces, Buchanan did nothing, leaving Lincoln to inherit a crisis that had already spiraled beyond control. The Confederate states moved quickly to establish their new government. They chose Montgomery, Alabama, as their temporary capital and elected Jefferson Davis of Mississippi as their president. Davis was a West Point graduate, a Mexican war hero, and a former U.S. senator. In many ways, he seemed better qualified for the presidency than Lincoln. But Davis lacked Lincoln's political skills and his ability to inspire ordinary people. The Confederate Constitution was remarkably similar to the U.S. Constitution, with a few key differences. It explicitly protected slavery, prohibited tariffs designed to protect domestic industry, and limited the president to a single 6-year term. The document made clear that the Confederacy was not a revolutionary government seeking to overthrow the old order, but a conservative movement seeking to preserve a way of life they believed was under attack. As Lincoln prepared to take office, the nation teetered on the brink of war. Compromise efforts failed one by one. The Crittenden Compromise would have extended the Missouri Compromise line to the Pacific and guaranteed slavery where it existed, but Republicans refused to accept any expansion of slavery. A peace conference called by Virginia and attended by former President John Tyler accomplished nothing. The crisis had moved beyond the reach of political solutions. On March 4, 1861, Abraham Lincoln stood on the steps of the Capitol to deliver his inaugural address. Sharpshooters positioned on nearby rooftops scanned the crowd for potential assassins. Lincoln himself may have worn a mail vest beneath his coat. The very fact that such precautions were necessary showed how far the nation had fallen. Lincoln's inaugural address was a masterpiece of political rhetoric, firm, yet conciliatory, determined, yet sorrowful. He repeated his pledge not to interfere with slavery where it existed, but he made equally clear that he would not accept secession. No state upon its own mere motion can lawfully get out of the Union, he declared. The Union was perpetual, older than the Constitution, formed by the Declaration of Independence and strengthened by the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. Yet Lincoln ended with an appeal to the better angels of American nature. "We are not enemies, but friends," he declared. "We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." It was a beautiful sentiment, but words alone could not heal a nation this deeply divided. Even as Lincoln spoke, Confederate forces were surrounding federal installations throughout the South. The most symbolic of these was Fort Sumter, a federal fortress guarding Charleston Harbor in South Carolina. Major Robert Anderson commanded a small garrison of fewer than 100 men cut off from resupply and running low on provisions. Lincoln faced an impossible choice. If he resupplied Fort Sumter, the South would see it as an act of war. If he abandoned it, he would be accepting the legitimacy of secession and the dissolution of the Union. For weeks he agonized over the decision while Confederate batteries ringed the fort and tensions mounted. The decision was ultimately taken out of Lincoln's hands. On April 12, 1861, at 4:30 in the morning, Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter. The bombardment continued for 34 hours until Major Anderson, his ammunition exhausted, and his fort in ruins, surrendered. Miraculously, no one was killed in the bombardment, though one Union soldier died when a cannon exploded during the surrender ceremony. The war that would claim over 600,000 American lives had begun with a bloodless bombardment of a federal fort. But the symbolism was unmistakable. The South had fired the first shot. Lincoln could now frame the conflict not as a war to end slavery, but as a war to preserve the Union and defend federal authority against armed rebellion. Lincoln's response was swift and decisive. On April 15th, he called for 75,000 volunteers to serve for 90 days to suppress the rebellion. The call for troops forced the Upper South to choose sides. Virginia, the most populous and prestigious Southern state, had rejected secession in February, but Lincoln's call for troops pushed it over the edge. Virginia seceded on April 17th, followed by Arkansas on May 6th, Tennessee on May 7th, and North Carolina on May 20th. The loss of Virginia was particularly devastating for the Union cause. Not only was it the most populous Southern state, but it was home to the greatest military mind of the age, Robert E. Lee. Lincoln had secretly offered Lee command of the Union armies, but Lee could not bring himself to fight against his native state. "I cannot raise my hand against my birthplace, my home, my children," he told a friend. Instead, Lee resigned from the U.S. Army and accepted command of Virginia's forces. With Virginia's secession, the Confederate capital moved from Montgomery to Richmond, just 100 miles south of Washington. The symbolism was profound. The birthplace of Washington, Jefferson, and Madison had chosen to reject the Union those men had created. But Virginia's decision also brought something invaluable to the Confederacy military talent. Along with Lee came a generation of officers trained at West Point, who would prove themselves among the finest military commanders in American history. The border states became the crucial battleground for hearts and minds. Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Delaware all had strong Southern sympathies and significant slave populations, but they remained in the Union through a combination of political maneuvering, military pressure, and Lincoln's careful handling. Maryland was particularly crucial. If it seceded, Washington, D.C. would be completely surrounded by Confederate territory. Lincoln suspended habeas corpus in Maryland and arrested pro-Confederate legislators to prevent a secession vote. Kentucky, the birthplace of both Lincoln and Jefferson Davis, declared neutrality, hoping to avoid the conflict altogether. But neutrality proved impossible when Confederate forces occupied Columbus in September 1861, prompting Union forces to occupy Paducah. Missouri descended into a vicious guerrilla war that would continue throughout the conflict, pitting neighbor against neighbor in a preview of the brutality to come. As both sides mobilized for war, the differences between North and South became starkly apparent. The Union enjoyed overwhelming advantages in population, industry, and transportation. 23 states with 22 million people faced 11 states with 9 million people, 3.5 million of whom were enslaved and could not fight for the Confederacy. The North produced 90% of America's manufactured goods, had twice as many miles of railroad track, and controlled the Navy. But the Confederacy had advantages of its own. They were fighting on home ground, defending their territory, rather than conquering someone else's. Their population was more militarily inclined. The South had produced a disproportionate number of the Army's officers before the war. Most importantly, they didn't need to win. They only needed to survive long enough for the North to grow tired of the cost in blood and treasure. The military strategies reflected these realities. Union General Winfield Scott proposed the Anaconda Plan, a naval blockade, to strangle Confederate trade while Union forces gained control of the Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy in two. It was a sound strategy, but the Northern public demanded action. Newspaper headlines screamed, "On to Richmond," and politicians promised the rebellion would be crushed in 90 days. The Confederate strategy was essentially defensive: protect their territory, inflict heavy casualties on Union forces, and hope that Northern war weariness would lead to recognition of Confederate independence. They looked to the American Revolution as their model, a smaller, weaker force that had worn down a stronger opponent through persistence and foreign intervention. The first major battle shattered any illusions about a quick war. On July 21, 1861, Union forces under General Irvin McDowell marched from Washington toward the Confederate capital at Richmond. They met Confederate forces under General Pierre Beauregard along a small stream called Bull Run, near the town of Manassas, Virginia. The First Battle of Bull Run began as a Union success. McDowell's forces crossed the stream and pushed Confederate troops back toward Henry House Hill. Spectators from Washington, including congressmen and their wives, had driven out in carriages to watch what they expected to be the rebellion's death blow. They spread picnic blankets on nearby hills and prepared to celebrate victory. But Confederate reinforcements arrived by railroad, the first time in military history that rail transport changed the outcome of a battle. Brigadier General Thomas Jackson's Virginia Brigade stood firm on Henry House Hill, earning Jackson the nickname Stonewall, when General Barnard Bee rallied his men by shouting, "There is Jackson standing like a stone wall." The Confederate line held, then counterattacked. Union forces, many of whom were 90-day volunteers whose enlistments were about to expire, broke and ran. The retreat became a rout. Union soldiers threw away their weapons and equipment as they fled back toward Washington, mixing with the panicked spectators in a chaotic jumble of carriages, wagons, and running men. Confederate forces were too disorganized to pursue effectively, but the psychological impact was enormous. The war would not be over in 90 days. This was going to be a long, bloody conflict. Both sides used the shock of Bull Run to mobilize more seriously for war. Lincoln called for 500,000 three-year volunteers and placed General George McClellan in command of what would become the Army of the Potomac. McClellan was young, energetic, and had won early victories in Western Virginia. The soldiers loved him, calling him Little Mac, and he proved to be a superb organizer and trainer. But McClellan had fatal flaws as a commander. He consistently overestimated enemy strength, thanks to wildly inaccurate intelligence from Detective Alan Pinkerton. He became obsessed with preparation and planning, always believing he needed just a few more weeks, a few more men, a few more supplies before he could move. Most damaging of all, he developed a messiah complex, believing that only he could save the Union, and he began to treat Lincoln and the civilian government with barely concealed contempt. While McClellan drilled his army outside Washington, other Union commanders were winning crucial victories in the West. In February 1862, a relatively unknown general named Ulysses S. Grant captured Fort Henry on the Tennessee River and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River, opening pathways into the Confederate heartland. When the Confederate commander at Fort Donelson asked for terms, Grant replied with words that made him famous. "No terms, except an unconditional and immediate surrender, can be accepted." Grant's victories gave the Union control of central Tennessee and made him a national hero. Born Hiram Ulysses Grant, he had graduated from West Point in the middle of his class and served competently in the Mexican War before resigning from the Army in 1854. He had failed at farming and business, working as a clerk in his father's leather goods store when the war began. Now at age 39, he had found his calling. The capture of New Orleans in April 1862 by Admiral David Farragut gave the Union control of the mouth of the Mississippi River. Farragut's fleet had run past Confederate forts in a daring nighttime operation, with the admiral reportedly lashed to the rigging of his flagship Hartford to avoid being knocked overboard by enemy fire. The capture of America's largest and wealthiest southern city was a devastating blow to Confederate morale and finances. But the most devastating battle of the early war came at a small log church called Shiloh in southwestern Tennessee. On April 6, 1862, Confederate forces under Albert Sidney Johnston launched a surprise attack on Grant's army. The Confederates achieved complete tactical surprise, driving Union forces back toward the Tennessee River in confusion and panic. General Johnston seemed on the verge of winning the Confederacy's greatest victory when a bullet severed an artery in his leg during the afternoon fighting. He bled to death before anyone realized how seriously he was wounded, and command passed to Beauregard. That night, Beauregard telegraphed Richmond that he had won a complete victory and would finish off Grant's army in the morning. But Grant had been reinforced during the night by the Army of the Ohio under Don Carlos Buell. On April 7th, it was the Confederates who were surprised as Grant counterattacked with fresh troops. The Confederate Army retreated to Corinth, Mississippi, leaving the field to the Union. The casualties at Shiloh shocked both sides. Over 23,000 men had been killed, wounded, or missing in 2 days of fighting, more than had been lost in all previous American wars combined. Grant was criticized for being caught by surprise and nearly defeated, but Lincoln defended him. When politicians demanded Grant's removal, Lincoln replied, "I can't spare this man. He fights." The bloodshed at Shiloh marked a turning point in how Americans understood this war. The romantic notions of glorious battle that had prevailed after Bull Run died in the Tennessee mud. This was going to be a war of attrition, a war that would test the very soul of the nation. As Grant later wrote, "Up to the Battle of Shiloh, one turn," as well as thousands of other citizens believed that the rebellion against the government would collapse suddenly and soon if a decisive victory could be gained over any of its armies. After Shiloh, Grant understood that the Confederacy would have to be ground down, its armies destroyed, its will to fight broken. It was a harsh realization, but it would guide Union strategy for the rest of the war. The age of limited war was over. Total war was about to begin. Meanwhile, in Virginia, McClellan had finally begun his advance on Richmond. Rather than marching overland from Washington, he transported his army by ship to the Virginia Peninsula, planning to approach the Confederate capital from the southeast. The Peninsula Campaign began promisingly in March 1862, But McClellan's chronic overcaution soon asserted itself. Facing a Confederate force under General John Magruder that was less than half the size of his own army, McClellan convinced himself he was outnumbered and settled in for a siege of Yorktown. Magruder, a former actor, put on a brilliant deception, marching the same troops back and forth to create the illusion of a much larger force. For a month, McClellan's 100,000-man army was held in place by fewer than 15,000 Confederates. When the Confederates finally abandoned Yorktown, McClellan pursued, slowly fighting a series of small engagements as he approached Richmond. By late May, Union forces were close enough to the Confederate capital to hear church bells ringing in the city. Richmond seemed about to fall, and Confederate government officials prepared to evacuate. Then Robert E. Lee took command of Confederate forces defending Richmond. When General Joseph Johnston was wounded at the Battle of Seven Pines, Confederate President Jefferson Davis turned to his military advisor. Lee was not the obvious choice. He had failed in his only previous field command in Western Virginia, earning the derisive nickname Granny Lee from Confederate newspapers. But Davis recognized Lee's strategic brilliance and appointed him commander of what Lee renamed the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee's assumption of command transformed the war in Virginia. Where Johnston had been cautious and defensive, Lee was aggressive and willing to take risks. He immediately began planning an offensive to drive McClellan away from Richmond, even though the Union Army was larger and better equipped. Lee understood that the Confederacy could not win a defensive war. They had to seize the initiative and force the Union to fight on Confederate terms. The 7 days battles that followed from June 25 to July 1, 1862, established Lee's reputation as one of history's great military commanders. In a series of coordinated attacks, Lee drove McClellan's army away from Richmond and back toward the James River. The Union Army was never defeated decisively, but McClellan's nerve was broken. Despite still outnumbering Lee significantly, he retreated to a defensive position at Harrison's Landing and demanded massive reinforcements before he would resume the offensive. The Peninsula Campaign's failure was a devastating blow to Union morale. After a year of war, Richmond remained in Confederate hands, and Lee's army seemed stronger than ever. Northern newspapers that had once proclaimed the rebellion nearly crushed now spoke of the conflict lasting for years. The reality of what they faced was beginning to sink in. The Confederacy would not collapse easily, and victory would require sacrifices no one had imagined when the war began. As summer turned to autumn in 1862, the war entered a new and darker phase. The Peninsula Campaign's failure had shattered Northern hopes for a quick victory, while Lee's success emboldened the Confederacy to believe they might actually win their independence. But both sides were about to discover that the conflict would demand even greater sacrifices than anyone had yet imagined. Lincoln faced mounting pressure from all directions. Radical Republicans demanded he move faster against slavery, arguing that the war could never be won while the South's economic foundation remained intact. Conservative Democrats and War Democrats worried that any move against slavery would drive the border states into the Confederacy. Meanwhile, European powers watched carefully, waiting to see if the Confederate experiment would succeed. The president wrestled with the slavery question through the long, hot summer of 1862. He had always believed slavery was morally wrong, but he also understood the delicate political balance that held the Union together. "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union," he wrote to newspaper editor Horace Greeley, with or without slavery. But privately, Lincoln was moving toward a decision that would transform the war's very nature. In Virginia, Lee was preparing his own transformation of the conflict. Rather than waiting for McClellan to reorganize and attack again, Lee decided to carry the war north. An invasion of Maryland would accomplish several goals. It would take the fighting out of war-torn Virginia during harvest season, potentially bring Maryland into the Confederacy, and might convince European powers to recognize Confederate independence. Most importantly, it would show the North that the Confederacy was not merely defending itself, but could strike at the Union's heartland. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia crossed the Potomac River into Maryland in early September 1862, their bands playing "Maryland, My Maryland" as they marched through the streets of Frederick. The Confederate soldiers presented a startling contrast to the well-equipped Union forces they had been fighting. Many were barefoot, their uniforms reduced to rags, their rifles held together with wire and string. Yet their morale was sky-high. They had driven McClellan from the gates of Richmond, and now they were carrying the war to the enemy. The Maryland campaign revealed both Lee's strategic brilliance and his willingness to take enormous risks. He divided his already outnumbered army into multiple columns, sending Stonewall Jackson to capture the Union garrison at Harper's Ferry, while other forces moved toward Hagerstown and Pennsylvania. It was a dangerous gamble that violated every principle of military orthodoxy, but Lee understood that conventional tactics would never give the Confederacy victory over the Union's superior resources. McClellan, recalled from the peninsula to deal with Lee's invasion, moved with uncharacteristic speed to intercept the Confederate forces. For once, fortune smiled on the Union commander. On September 13th, 2 Union soldiers discovered Lee's detailed battle plans wrapped around 3 cigars in an abandoned Confederate campsite. The document, known as the Lost Order, revealed that Lee had divided his army and gave McClellan a golden opportunity to defeat the Confederate forces in detail. Even with this incredible intelligence windfall, McClellan moved cautiously. He had overwhelming superiority in numbers, nearly 90,000 men against Lee's 55,000, but he convinced himself that he faced a larger Confederate force. Still, he managed to concentrate his forces quickly enough to catch Lee at a disadvantage near the town of Sharpsburg, Maryland, along Antietam Creek. The Battle of Antietam on September 17, 1862, became the bloodiest single day in American military history. McClellan launched a series of poorly coordinated attacks against Lee's defensive positions, each assault achieving local success before being repulsed by Confederate reinforcements. The fighting raged from dawn to dusk across cornfields, through a sunken road that became known as Bloody Lane, and around a stone bridge that changed hands multiple times. The horror of Antietam defied description. In the cornfield north of Sharpsburg, soldiers advanced through chest-high stalks, unable to see their enemies until they were almost close enough to touch. Men fell by the hundreds, their bodies creating gruesome pathways through the grain. At Bloody Lane, Confederate defenders poured devastating fire into attacking Union columns until the road was literally carpeted with blue-clad bodies. The stone bridge, later renamed Antietam Creek Bridge, became a killing ground where Union forces made repeated frontal assaults against well-positioned Confederate defenders. By evening, over 23,000 Americans had become casualties. Lee's army was shattered, his invasion a failure, his forces barely holding their positions along the Potomac. McClellan had fresh reserves that could have delivered the decisive blow, but he hesitated, convinced that Lee was planning a counterattack. That night, Lee's battered army slipped back across the Potomac into Virginia, ending the Maryland campaign. Antietam was both a Union victory and a missed opportunity. Lee's first invasion of the North had been turned back, potentially saving the Union cause from foreign intervention. But McClellan's failure to pursue and destroy Lee's weakened army meant the war would continue. Lincoln visited McClellan after the battle, urging him to follow up his victory, but the general remained convinced he needed reinforcements before moving. For Lincoln, Antietam provided something even more valuable than a military victory, the political cover he needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. He had been waiting for a Union success to avoid making emancipation look like an act of desperation. 5 days after Antietam, on September 22, 1862, Lincoln announced that on January 1, 1863, all slaves in areas still in rebellion would be forever free. The Emancipation Proclamation transformed the war's moral landscape. What had begun as a conflict to preserve the Union became a war to end slavery. The proclamation applied only to areas still in rebellion, leaving slavery intact in the loyal border states. But its symbolic impact was enormous. European powers, particularly Britain, could no longer consider recognizing the Confederacy without appearing to support slavery. More importantly, it gave the war a moral purpose that resonated with millions of Americans and Europeans who saw slavery as a fundamental evil. The proclamation also opened the door for African Americans to join the Union war effort as soldiers. Frederick Douglass had been advocating for black military service since the war began, arguing that, "Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters U.S., let him get an eagle on his button, and a musket on his shoulder, and bullets in his pocket, and there is no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship." Now that opportunity was finally at hand. Confederate reaction to the Emancipation Proclamation was swift and furious. Jefferson Davis declared it the most execrable measure recorded in the history of guilty man, and the Confederate Congress authorized the execution of captured Union officers commanding black troops. White Southerners saw the proclamation as proof of their worst fears that Lincoln intended to incite a slave rebellion that would destroy Southern society. The proclamation also faced significant opposition in the North. Democratic newspapers denounced it as unconstitutional, and many soldiers questioned whether they were willing to die to free slaves. The 1862 midterm elections saw significant Democratic gains as voters expressed their dissatisfaction with the war's new direction. But Lincoln held firm understanding that emancipation was both morally necessary and strategically vital to Union victory. Meanwhile, the war in the West continued to favor Union forces. After capturing New Orleans and much of Tennessee, Union armies pushed deeper into Confederate territory. The Mississippi River became the focal point of Union strategy, with General Grant moving south toward the Confederate fortress city of Vicksburg, while Admiral Farragut's fleet controlled the river's mouth. Vicksburg presented a formidable challenge. Perched on high bluffs overlooking the Mississippi, the city's artillery could sink any vessel attempting to pass. Confederate engineers had fortified the approaches with an intricate system of trenches, redoubts, and artillery positions. The city's commander, General John Pemberton, had over 30,000 troops and supplies to withstand a lengthy siege. Most importantly, Vicksburg controlled the last major Confederate link across the Mississippi River. Grant's first attempts to capture Vicksburg failed miserably. Direct assaults on the city's fortifications were repulsed with heavy casualties. Efforts to bypass the city by digging canals through the Mississippi's meandering bends came to nothing. Political pressure mounted in Washington for Grant's removal, with critics pointing to his previous problems with alcohol and his costly victories at Shiloh and elsewhere. But Lincoln continued to support his most aggressive general, reportedly saying, "I can't spare this man, he fights." The winter of 1862-1863 found both armies locked in their respective theaters, neither able to deliver a decisive blow. In Virginia, Lee's army had recovered from Antietam and was preparing for the spring campaign season. McClellan had finally been replaced by General Ambrose Burnside, whose disastrous assault on Lee's positions at Fredericksburg in December resulted in over 12,000 Union casualties for no tactical gain. The slaughter at Fredericksburg shocked the North, and led to Burnside's replacement by General Joseph Hooker, nicknamed Fighting Joe. The human cost of the war was becoming impossible to ignore. Casualty lists filled newspaper columns, and scarcely a family in America remained untouched by loss. The initial enthusiasm that had sent young men marching off to war had been replaced by grim determination. This was no longer a conflict that would be settled by a single decisive battle or brilliant maneuver. It had become a war of attrition that would test each side's will to continue fighting. In the South, the Union naval blockade was beginning to bite. Shortages of manufactured goods drove prices sky high, and the Confederate government resorted to impressment-forced purchases at below-market prices to supply its armies. The Confederate currency, backed only by faith in ultimate victory, depreciated rapidly. By early 1863, it took several Confederate dollars to buy what one had purchased at the war's beginning. Northern industry, by contrast, boomed as government contracts stimulated production of everything from uniforms to weapons to railroad equipment. The Union's ability to outproduce the Confederacy in war materials was becoming a decisive advantage. Northern factories turned out rifles, cannon ammunition, and supplies at rates the agricultural South could never match. Yet the Confederacy retained significant advantages that kept hope alive. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia had proven itself capable of defeating much larger Union forces through superior tactics and leadership. Confederate forces fighting on home ground enjoyed the support of the local population and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Most importantly, the Confederacy needed only to survive long enough for Northern war weariness to force a negotiated settlement. The spring of 1863 would test whether these Confederate advantages could overcome the Union's growing material superiority. In Virginia, Hooker prepared an ambitious campaign to outflank Lee's army and force a decisive battle. In Mississippi, Grant was developing a bold new plan to capture Vicksburg by approaching it from the south and east. In Tennessee, Union forces under William Rosecrans prepared to advance against Confederate forces commanded by Braxton Bragg. As the armies stirred from their winter quarters, both sides understood that 1863 would likely be the decisive year of the war. The Confederacy could not sustain the conflict indefinitely against the Union's superior resources. If they could not force a military decision in 1863, their cause might be lost. The Union, meanwhile, faced growing political pressure to end the war quickly or risk losing support for continued fighting. The stage was set for the climactic battles that would determine America's fate. In the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, a small college town called Gettysburg was about to become the site of the war's turning point. Along the Mississippi River, the fortress city of Vicksburg prepared for the siege that would split the Confederacy in two. And in Washington, Abraham Lincoln continued to guide the nation through its darkest hour, sustained by his unshakable belief that America must emerge from this trial, a new birth of freedom. The war that had begun with romantic notions of quick victory and minimal bloodshed was about to enter its most terrible phase. The battles of 1863 would claim tens of thousands of lives and finally answer the question that had brought the nation to war, whether America would remain half slave and half free or become something entirely new. The fate of 4 million enslaved people hung in the balance along with the survival of the Union itself. The year 1863 dawned with both sides bloodied but unbroken, each convinced that decisive victory lay just beyond the next ridge, the next river, the next great battle. Yet something had fundamentally changed in the character of this war. The naive enthusiasm of 1861 had been buried in the mud of Shiloh and the cornfields of Antietam. What remained was a grim determination to see this through to whatever end awaited. In the Confederate capital of Richmond, Jefferson Davis faced mounting pressures that would have broken a lesser man. The Union blockade was strangling Southern commerce, inflation was spiraling out of control, and food shortages plagued even the capital itself. Confederate soldiers' families wrote desperate letters begging their menfolk to come home and help with the harvest. Desertion rates climbed steadily as the war dragged on with no end in sight. Yet Davis maintained an almost mystical faith in Confederate independence. A West Point graduate and Mexican War veteran, he possessed the bearing of a natural aristocrat and the conviction of a true believer. Where Lincoln governed through persuasion and political maneuvering, Davis ruled through force of will and unwavering principle. It was both his greatest strength and his fatal weakness. The Confederate president's relationship with his generals reflected his rigid personality. He quarreled constantly with Joseph Johnston, whom he considered too cautious. He maintained an uneasy alliance with Braxton Bragg, despite that general's obvious incompetence. Only with Robert E. Lee did Davis find a commander who combined strategic brilliance with the personal diplomacy needed to work with the prickly Confederate leader. Lee himself had become something approaching a living legend in the South. His victories at the 7 days' Second Bull Run, Fredericksburg, and soon Chancellorsville convinced many Confederates that divine providence favored their cause. Here was a man who seemed capable of working miracles with inferior numbers and limited resources. If anyone could deliver Confederate independence, surely it was the gray-bearded Virginian who never seemed to lose a battle. But Lee understood better than most the precarious nature of Confederate prospects. Each victory came at a cost his army could ill afford. Unlike the Union, which could replace its losses through immigration and a larger population, every Confederate casualty was irreplaceable. Lee's army was slowly bleeding to death, one tactical victory at a time. The general who would prove Lee's nemesis was at that moment struggling with his own set of challenges along the Mississippi River. Ulysses Grant had spent months trying to capture Vicksburg through conventional approaches, all of which had failed spectacularly. His army was bogged down in the swamps and bayous of Louisiana, his reputation under attack from newspapers and politicians who questioned his competence. Grant's drinking had become the subject of widespread speculation. Political enemies whispered that he was an unreliable drunk who owed his position to political connections rather than military ability. The rumors followed him everywhere, a constant reminder of his pre-war failures in business and farming. Yet Grant possessed something his critics lacked: an absolute clarity about what needed to be done, and the moral courage to do it regardless of cost. While Grant pondered his next move against Vicksburg, events in Virginia were building toward another confrontation between Lee and the Army of the Potomac. General Joseph Hooker, commanding Union forces after Burnside's disaster at Fredericksburg, had reorganized his army and developed an ambitious plan to outflank Lee's positions along the Rappahannock River. Hooker was everything McClellan had not been: aggressive, confident, and eager for battle. His soldiers called him Fighting Joe, and he had earned their respect through tactical competence and genuine concern for their welfare. He improved camp sanitation, regularized the supply system, and instituted a leave policy that allowed men to visit their families. By spring 1863, the Army of the Potomac was larger, better equipped, and more confident than it had ever been. The plan Hooker devised for the spring campaign was genuinely clever. He would leave a substantial force to pin Lee's army in position near Fredericksburg, while taking the bulk of his forces upstream to cross the Rappahannock and Rapidan rivers. This flanking movement would force Lee to abandon his strong defensive positions and fight on ground of Hooker's choosing. With over 130,000 men against Lee's 60,000, Hooker had every reason to expect success. The campaign began promisingly enough. Union forces crossed the rivers without opposition and concentrated near a crossroads tavern called Chancellorsville, deep in a tangled forest region known locally as the Wilderness. Hooker established his headquarters at the Chancellor House and prepared to advance eastward toward Lee's army. Everything was proceeding according to plan. But Lee had not earned his reputation through conventional thinking. Rather than retreating in the face of superior numbers, he decided to attack. Leaving a small force under Jubal Early to hold the Fredericksburg lines, Lee marched west with the bulk of his army to confront Hooker in the wilderness. It was a characteristically audacious decision that violated every principle of military orthodoxy. The Battle of Chancellorsville began on May 1, 1863, when Lee's advancing columns encountered Hooker's forces moving east from their river crossings. The initial skirmishing went badly for the Confederates, who were badly outnumbered and fighting in unfamiliar terrain. But something strange happened to Hooker's nerve. Despite his overwhelming superiority in numbers, he ordered his army to fall back to defensive positions around Chancellorsville. That evening, Lee made perhaps the most audacious decision of his career. Meeting with Stonewall Jackson by a campfire, he decided to divide his already outnumbered army yet again. Jackson would take 26,000 men on a flanking march around the Union right, while Lee held Hooker's attention with just 17,000 troops. It was the kind of desperate gamble that could result in either brilliant victory or catastrophic defeat. Jackson's flank march on May 2nd became one of the war's most famous military movements. Using local guides who knew the forest paths, his column moved through the wilderness for most of the day, hidden from Union observation by the thick woods. Union scouts spotted the movement, but misinterpreted it as a Confederate retreat. Hooker, convinced that Lee was withdrawing, prepared to pursue. Late in the afternoon, Jackson's men burst from the woods onto the Union right flank, which was held by the 11th Corps under General Oliver Howard. The attack achieved complete surprise. Union soldiers were cooking dinner, playing cards, and writing letters when the rebel yell erupted from the forest, and thousands of Confederate soldiers poured into their camps. The 11th Corps collapsed in panic, streaming eastward in complete disorder. Jackson's assault rolled up nearly 2 miles of Union line before darkness and confusion finally halted the advance. The Confederate commander, eager to press his advantage, rode forward with a small party to reconnoiter the Union positions. As they returned through the darkness, nervous Confederate pickets mistook Jackson's party for Union cavalry and opened fire. Jackson was struck by 3 bullets, one of which shattered his left arm. The wounding of Stonewall Jackson marked the beginning of the end for Confederate hopes in the East. Jackson was Lee's most trusted lieutenant, the one general who could be counted on to execute complex maneuvers with speed and precision. His loss would prove irreplaceable, though few recognized it at the time. Jackson himself seemed to understand the significance of his wounding, reportedly saying, as he was carried from the field, "Let us pass over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." Despite Jackson's wounding, the Battle of Chancellorsville continued for 3 more days. Lee pressed his attacks against Hooker's demoralized forces, while simultaneously fighting off Union attacks from Fredericksburg. In a series of desperate actions, the Confederate Army held together through sheer force of will and superior leadership. Hooker, concussed by a Confederate shell that struck his headquarters, seemed to lose all offensive spirit. On May 6th, Hooker ordered a general retreat across the Rappahannock, abandoning the field to Lee's army. The Battle of Chancellorsville was over, and once again Lee had achieved a seemingly impossible victory against overwhelming odds. Northern newspapers called it the Army of the Potomac's greatest humiliation, while Southern papers hailed Lee as the greatest general since Napoleon. But the victory came at a terrible price. Confederate casualties numbered over 13,000, including many irreplaceable veterans and officers. Most devastating of all was Jackson's condition, which worsened despite initial optimism. Pneumonia set in, and on May 10, 1863, Stonewall Jackson died at the age of 39. Lee's reaction was telling. "I have lost my right arm," he said simply. Jackson's death deprived Lee of his most capable subordinate at precisely the moment when the Confederate cause faced its greatest crisis. Lee would never again have a lieutenant capable of executing his complex battle plans with Jackson's combination of speed, initiative, and tactical brilliance. The Army of Northern Virginia would continue to fight magnificently, but it would never again achieve the perfect coordination between commander and subordinate that had made Chancellorsville possible. Meanwhile, far to the west, Grant was finally solving the puzzle of Vicksburg. His breakthrough came not through military genius, but through simple persistence and willingness to take enormous risks. In April 1863, he made the unprecedented decision to march his army down the Louisiana side of the Mississippi River, while Admiral David Porter's gunboats ran past Vicksburg's batteries under cover of darkness. The naval passage was a harrowing affair. Confederate artillery pounded Porter's fleet as it steamed past Vicksburg in single file, the river lit by burning buildings that the defenders had set ablaze to illuminate their targets. Several vessels were hit, and one transport was sunk, but most of the fleet made it through. Grant now had the naval support he needed for his most audacious plan yet. Instead of attacking Vicksburg directly, Grant decided to cross the Mississippi below the city and approach it from the south and east. This meant abandoning his supply lines and living off the land in enemy territory, something no American general had attempted since the Revolution. Many of Grant's subordinates thought he had lost his mind, but the plan worked brilliantly. Grant's army crossed the Mississippi at Bruinsburg on April 30, 1863, and immediately began one of the war's most remarkable campaigns. In just over 2 weeks, his forces marched 180 miles, fought 5 battles, and captured the Mississippi state capital at Jackson before turning west toward Vicksburg. Confederate forces under General John Pemberton were caught completely off guard by Grant's rapid movements and found themselves trapped inside Vicksburg's fortifications. The siege of Vicksburg began on May 25, 1863, and would last for 47 days. Grant's army completely surrounded the city, cutting off all supplies and communication with the outside world. Inside Vicksburg, civilians and soldiers alike faced steadily worsening conditions as food supplies dwindled and Confederate artillery ammunition ran low. People took shelter in caves dug into the hillsides, emerging only when absolutely necessary. The suffering inside Vicksburg was intense, but not unique. Throughout the South, civilian populations were feeling the war's impact more directly as Union armies penetrated deeper into Confederate territory. The romanticized vision of war that had prevailed in 1861 was giving way to a much harsher reality. This was becoming a war not just between armies, but between entire societies. In Virginia, Lee was planning his own response to the deteriorating Confederate situation. With Jackson dead and his army weakened by the casualties at Chancellorsville, a defensive strategy seemed to promise only slow defeat. Lee decided instead on his boldest gamble, yet a second invasion of the North that would carry the war into Pennsylvania. Lee's reasoning was both military and political. A successful invasion might force Grant to abandon his siege of Vicksburg to defend Washington. It would take the war out of war-torn Virginia during the crucial harvest season. Most importantly, a Confederate victory on Northern soil might convince European powers to recognize Confederate independence and persuade Northern voters that the war was too costly to continue. The Army of Northern Virginia began moving north in early June 1863, crossing the Potomac River into Maryland, and then continuing into Pennsylvania. Lee's 75,000 men were organized into 3 corps commanded by James Longstreet, Richard Ewell, and A.P. Hill. It was a veteran force hardened by 2 years of fighting and supremely confident in their commander's ability to work miracles. The Union response was swift but confused. Hooker, still commanding the Army of the Potomac, proposed abandoning the pursuit of Lee's army and instead attacking Richmond while it was lightly defended. Lincoln and General-in-Chief Henry Halleck rejected this plan, insisting that Hooker's job was to find and fight Lee's army. The disagreement led to Hooker's resignation just days before the climactic battle with General George Meade taking command of the Army of the Potomac on June 28th. Meade was a competent but unspectacular general, known for his engineering skills and hot temper, rather than for inspiring leadership. He had commanded a corps at Chancellorsville and was respected by his peers, but he lacked the time to put his stamp on the army before the coming battle. His appointment so close to combat reflected the chronic instability in Union command that had plagued the Army of the Potomac since McClellan's removal. Neither Lee nor Meade intended to fight at Gettysburg. The battle began almost by accident when Confederate forces searching for supplies encountered Union cavalry on the morning of July 1st, 1863. What started as a minor skirmish escalated rapidly as both sides fed more troops into the fighting. By afternoon, a full-scale battle was raging through the streets of the small Pennsylvania town. The first day's fighting went well for the Confederates. Union forces under General John Reynolds fought stubbornly, but were gradually pushed back through Gettysburg to defensive positions on Cemetery Hill south of town. Reynolds himself was killed early in the action, struck by a Confederate sharpshooter while positioning his troops. His death was a significant loss for the Union cause, as he was considered one of the Army's most capable corps commanders. As evening approached on July 1st, Lee faced a crucial decision. His army had won a tactical victory and driven Union forces from the field, but Meade's army was concentrating rapidly on the high ground south of Gettysburg. Lee could withdraw and force the Union army to attack him in a position of his choosing, or he could press his advantage and attempt to complete the victory before Meade's forces were fully assembled. Lee chose to attack a decision that would prove fateful. His reasons were understandable. His army was confident after the day's success. The Union forces appeared disorganized, and a decisive victory might end the war. But Lee was fighting without adequate reconnaissance. His cavalry under J.E.B. Stuart was absent on a raid that had left Lee blind to Union movements. He also lacked Stonewall Jackson's aggressive competence to execute complex attacks. The second day at Gettysburg, July 2nd, saw some of the war's fiercest fighting as Lee attempted to break the Union line. Longstreet's corps attacked the Union left flank, where desperate fighting raged around Little Round Top, the Wheatfield, and Devil's Den. Union defenders, commanded by officers like Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain of the 20th Maine, held their positions through sheer determination and tactical skill. Chamberlain's defense of Little Round Top became one of the battle's most celebrated actions. With his regiment running low on ammunition and Confederate forces preparing for another assault, Chamberlain ordered a bayonet charge that broke the Confederate attack and saved the Union left flank. His courage under fire and quick thinking exemplified the kind of inspired leadership that often determined the outcome of Civil War battles. Meanwhile, Ewell's corps attacked the Union right flank at Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill, but failed to coordinate effectively with Longstreet's assault. The piecemeal Confederate attacks allowed Union commanders to shift troops from quiet sectors to threatened points, maintaining the integrity of their defensive line. By evening, Lee's army had suffered heavy casualties, but achieved no decisive breakthrough. The third day at Gettysburg would become the most famous in American military history. Lee, still convinced that one more assault might break the Union line, ordered a massive artillery bombardment, followed by an infantry attack against the center of Meade's position on Cemetery Ridge. The assault would be led by George Pickett's fresh division, supported by troops from A.P. Hill's corps, about 15,000 men in total. The Confederate artillery bombardment began at 1:00 p.m. on July 3rd, with over 150 guns firing on the Union positions. The cannonade was impressive, but largely ineffective as most Confederate shells passed over the Union line and exploded harmlessly in the rear areas. Union Artillery Chief Henry Hunt ordered his batteries to stop firing, giving the Confederates the false impression that their bombardment had been successful. At 3:00 p.m., Pickett's division emerged from the woods on Seminary Ridge and began their advance across nearly a mile of open ground toward the Union center. It was a magnificent sight. 3 divisions of Confederate infantry advancing in perfect formation, battle flags, flying officers mounted and leading their men forward. But it was also a tactical disaster waiting to happen. The Union defenders on Cemetery Ridge waited until the Confederate line was within effective range before opening fire. Artillery loaded with canister shot, essentially giant shotgun shells, tore gaps in the advancing ranks. Infantry fire from behind stone walls cut down hundreds of Confederate soldiers. Still, the attack pressed forward with some Confederate troops actually reaching the Union line in what became known as the high water mark of the Confederacy. But the assault could not be sustained. Without support and facing overwhelming firepower, the Confederate survivors fell back across the bloody field, leaving over 6,000 casualties behind. Pickett's charge had failed catastrophically, and with it Lee's last hope of victory at Gettysburg. As the shattered remnants of the assault force returned to Confederate lines, Lee rode out to meet them, reportedly saying, "It is all my fault." The Battle of Gettysburg was over, and for the first time in his career, Robert E. Lee had suffered an unambiguous defeat. Confederate casualties numbered over 28,000, more than a third of Lee's army. The Army of Northern Virginia was still intact, but severely weakened, its aura of invincibility shattered. Lee offered his resignation to Jefferson Davis, who refused to accept it, but the Confederate cause had suffered a blow from which it would never fully recover. On July 4, 1863, as Lee began his retreat toward Virginia, news arrived that completed the Union's triumph. After 47 days of siege, Vicksburg had surrendered to Grant's army. General Pemberton, facing starvation and with no hope of relief, had finally accepted Grant's terms of unconditional surrender. The Mississippi River was now under complete Union control, and the Confederacy was split in two. The fall of Vicksburg was as strategically significant as the victory at Gettysburg. The Confederacy lost not only a vital fortress, but also an entire army of nearly 30,000 men. Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas were effectively cut off from the rest of the Confederacy, depriving the rebels of crucial supplies and manpower. Lincoln understood the victory's importance, writing to Grant, "The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea." The twin victories of Gettysburg and Vicksburg marked the turning point of the Civil War. Never again would Confederate forces seriously threaten Union territory. Never again would European intervention seem likely. The Confederacy could still fight, and would fight desperately, for nearly 2 more years, but it could no longer realistically hope to win its independence through military victory. Yet the war was far from over. In Tennessee, Confederate forces under Braxton Bragg were preparing to attack the Union Army commanded by William Rosecrans. The war in the Trans-Mississippi would continue with varying intensity until 1865. Most importantly, the South's will to resist remained unbroken despite the disasters of July 1863. The Confederacy would have to be ground down piece by piece, a process that would require more blood and treasure than anyone yet imagined. Lincoln understood that the Union's recent victories, dramatic as they were, represented only the beginning of the end rather than the end itself. In November 1863, he would travel to Gettysburg to dedicate a national cemetery for the battle's dead. His brief remarks on that occasion would transform the war's meaning, redefining the conflict as a struggle not merely to preserve the Union, but to ensure that, Government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The Gettysburg Address, just 272 words long, accomplished what thousands of editorials and speeches had failed to do. It gave the war a transcendent purpose that justified its terrible cost. No longer was this simply a political dispute that had gotten out of hand. It was a test of whether democratic government could survive in a world dominated by monarchies and aristocracies. It was a struggle to determine whether the promises of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal could be made real. But rhetoric, however inspiring, could not end the war. That would require more fighting, more dying, and more sacrifice than Americans had yet endured. The campaigns of 1864 would bring new horrors, as Grant and Sherman embraced a strategy of total war designed to break not just Confederate armies, but Confederate society itself. The romantic age of warfare was ending, replaced by something harder, more practical, and infinitely more destructive. As 1863 drew to a close, both sides prepared for what they knew would be the war's final phase. The Confederacy, bloodied but still defiant, would make its last desperate stands in Virginia and Georgia. The Union, finally united behind a clear purpose, and led by generals who understood what victory required, would press forward regardless of cost. The question was no longer whether the Union would win, but how much more suffering it would take to end the rebellion once and for all. The answer to that question would come through the crucible of 1864, a year that would witness warfare of unprecedented savagery and scope. As winter gave way to spring, Abraham Lincoln faced a decision that would define not just the remaining war, but the very nature of American military leadership. He needed a general who could match Lee's tactical brilliance, while possessing something Lee lacked: the moral courage to accept enormous casualties in pursuit of strategic victory. That general was already emerging from the Western theater. Ulysses Grant, the former store clerk, who had found his calling in war, possessed qualities that made him uniquely suited to command the Union's vast military machine. Unlike his predecessors in the East, Grant understood that the Confederacy's greatest strength lay not in its armies, but in its will to continue fighting. Breaking that will would require a fundamentally different approach to warfare. In March 1864, Lincoln summoned Grant to Washington and promoted him to General-in-Chief of all Union armies. It was a moment fraught with symbolism. Here was a Western general, a man who had risen through merit rather than political connections, taking command of forces that had been led by a succession of Eastern aristocrats and professional soldiers. Grant's first meeting with Lincoln revealed the mutual respect that would sustain their partnership through the war's bloodiest phase. Grant's strategic vision was elegant in its simplicity and terrible in its implications. Rather than allowing Confederate armies to operate independently while Union forces pursued separate campaigns, he would coordinate simultaneous offensives across multiple theaters. The Confederacy would be squeezed from all directions, preventing them from reinforcing threatened sectors with troops from quiet fronts. It was a strategy that required enormous resources and unflinching determination, but the Union finally possessed both. The centerpiece of Grant's grand strategy was his own advance against Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Unlike previous Union commanders who had sought to capture Richmond, Grant focused on destroying Lee's army as a fighting force. The Confederate capital would fall naturally once Lee's veterans were eliminated. This shift from geographical to military objectives reflected Grant's clear understanding of how wars were actually won and lost. Grant's campaign began on May 5, 1864, when the Army of the Potomac crossed the Rapidan River and entered the same wilderness where Lee had triumphed at Chancellorsville the previous year. The thick woods and tangled undergrowth that had aided Lee's defensive victory now became the setting for some of the war's most horrific fighting. Soldiers fought blind in the darkness beneath the forest canopy, often shooting at muzzle flashes and shadows. The Battle of the Wilderness raged for 2 days without clear result. Fires started by artillery rounds spread through the dry underbrush, burning wounded soldiers alive as their comrades fought desperately to reach them. The screams of men trapped in the flames haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. Grant's losses were severe, over 17,000 casualties, but unlike his predecessors, he refused to retreat after a tactical defeat. Instead, Grant ordered his army to continue moving south, attempting to get between Lee's army and Richmond. The decision electrified the Army of the Potomac. For the first time since the war began, they had a commander who would not give up after one setback. As the soldiers realized they were advancing rather than retreating, they broke into spontaneous cheers. Finally, they had a general who would see this through to the end. Lee, recognizing Grant's intentions, raced to block the Union advance at a crossroads called Spotsylvania Courthouse. The resulting battle lasted for nearly 2 weeks and featured some of the war's most savage fighting. On May 12th, Grant launched a massive assault against a Confederate salient known as the Mule Shoe. The fighting at the Bloody Angle continued for 20 hours without pause, with soldiers literally standing on piles of corpses to fire over the earthworks. The carnage at Spotsylvania defied description. Trees were cut down by rifle fire, their trunks riddled with so many bullets they toppled over. Rain turned the battlefield into a muddy quagmire stained red with blood. Bodies were trampled into the earth until they became part of the fortifications themselves. Yet still, the armies fought on, driven by a momentum that seemed beyond human control. Grant's casualties during the Wilderness and Spotsylvania campaigns exceeded 36,000 men, more than Lee's entire army. Northern newspapers denounced him as a butcher who was squandering American lives for no apparent gain. Democratic politicians called for his removal, arguing that his tactics differed little from those of incompetent predecessors. But Lincoln stood firm, understanding that Grant was finally implementing the kind of warfare necessary to defeat the Confederacy. Lee's army, meanwhile, was slowly bleeding to death. Confederate casualties could not be replaced as easily as Union losses, and Lee's tactical victories were becoming increasingly Pyrrhic. Each successful defense cost him veterans he could not afford to lose. Grant understood this arithmetic of attrition and was willing to accept heavy losses to impose even heavier ones on his opponent. The campaign continued through May and into June, with Grant persistently sidling southward toward Richmond, while Lee moved to block each advance. At Cold Harbor, Grant made one of his few serious tactical errors, ordering frontal assaults against well-prepared Confederate positions. The attacks failed catastrophically, with over 7,000 Union casualties in less than an hour. Grant later wrote that he regretted the Cold Harbor assault more than any other decision of the war. Yet even Cold Harbor served Grant's larger strategic purpose. While his army licked its wounds, Union forces elsewhere were implementing other components of his coordinated offensive. In Georgia, William Tecumseh Sherman was advancing toward Atlanta with 100,000 men, fighting a series of battles against Joseph Johnston's Confederate army. In the Shenandoah Valley, Franz Sigel was moving south to eliminate Confederate forces that had long used the valley as a highway to threaten Washington. Sherman's advance into Georgia represented a fundamental shift in how Americans thought about warfare. Where previous campaigns had focused on capturing enemy territory or defeating enemy armies, Sherman understood that modern war required breaking the enemy's will to resist. This meant targeting not just military forces, but the economic and psychological foundations of Confederate society. Sherman's opponent, Joseph Johnston, proved to be a master of defensive warfare. Rather than fighting costly battles, Johnston conducted a fighting retreat that inflicted maximum casualties on Union forces while preserving his own army. At Resaca New Hope Church and Kennesaw Mountain, Confederate forces fought from strong defensive positions before withdrawing to the next prepared line. It was brilliant defensive strategy that frustrated Sherman while keeping Confederate forces intact. But Johnston's cautious approach infuriated Jefferson Davis, who wanted aggressive action to stop Sherman's advance. In July 1864, Davis made one of his worst decisions of the war, replacing Johnston with John Bell Hood. Hood was a fighting general who had lost the use of an arm at Gettysburg and a leg at Chickamauga, but his aggressive instincts were exactly wrong for the strategic situation facing Confederate forces in Georgia. Hood immediately launched a series of attacks against Sherman's forces around Atlanta, suffering heavy casualties while failing to halt the Union advance. The battles of Peachtree Creek, Atlanta, and Ezra Church cost Hood nearly 20,000 men, losses the Confederacy could not afford. Sherman, meanwhile, began extending his lines around Atlanta, threatening to cut the city's railroad connections and force its evacuation. While Sherman battled Hood in Georgia, Grant faced his own crisis in Virginia. After Cold Harbor, he had attempted to capture Petersburg, the railroad center that supplied Richmond, but the initial attacks failed when Union commanders failed to exploit early advantages. The campaign settled into siege warfare, with both armies digging extensive trench systems that stretched for miles around the city. The siege of Petersburg introduced Americans to a new form of warfare that presaged the conflicts of the 20th century. Soldiers lived in elaborate earthworks, protected by barbed wire and sharpened stakes. Artillery bombardments continued day and night, while snipers made any movement above ground potentially fatal. Disease and exhaustion took an enormous toll on both armies as the siege dragged on through the summer heat. Grant attempted to break the deadlock through innovative tactics. Union engineers, many of whom had been coal miners before the war, dug a tunnel under Confederate lines and packed it with 4 tons of gunpowder. The explosion on July 30th created an enormous crater in the Confederate defenses, but the subsequent assault failed when Union troops became trapped in the crater itself. The Battle of the Crater cost Grant nearly 4,000 casualties while achieving nothing strategically. The failure at the crater reflected a broader problem facing Union forces in Virginia. Grant's relentless offensive had cost him over 60,000 casualties since crossing the Rapidan, and his army was showing signs of exhaustion. Morale problems increased as soldiers realized they were fighting a war of attrition, where victory would come only through enormous sacrifice. Many units were filled with drafted men and substitutes who lacked the commitment of earlier volunteers. Lincoln faced his own crisis as the 1864 election approached. Northern war weariness was reaching dangerous levels, with Democratic politicians promising a negotiated peace that would effectively recognize Confederate independence. General George McClellan, running as the Democratic candidate, represented the peace faction despite his own military service. Polls showed Lincoln trailing badly, and many Republicans urged him to postpone the election until after military victory. The president refused to consider postponing the election, understanding that doing so would undermine the very democratic principles for which the war was being fought. "We cannot have free government without elections," he declared, "and if the rebellion could force us to forego or postpone a national election, it might fairly claim to have already conquered and ruined us." Lincoln was prepared to accept electoral defeat rather than compromise constitutional government. The military situation in late summer 1864 seemed to justify Northern pessimism. Grant's army was bogged down in the Petersburg trenches, with no apparent prospect of breakthrough. Sherman was stalled outside Atlanta, seemingly unable to capture the city that had become a symbol of Confederate resistance. In the Shenandoah Valley, Confederate General Jubal Early had launched a raid that reached the outskirts of Washington itself, demonstrating that the Confederacy retained offensive capability. Then suddenly, the military picture changed dramatically. On September 2, 1864, Sherman's forces occupied Atlanta after Hood's army evacuated the city to avoid encirclement. The news electrified the North and transformed the political landscape. Here was the decisive victory that had seemed so elusive throughout the long, bloody summer. Sherman's laconic telegram to Lincoln, "Atlanta is ours and fairly won," became one of the war's most famous communications. The fall of Atlanta essentially guaranteed Lincoln's re-election. Northern voters who had been prepared to accept a negotiated peace now saw the possibility of total victory. Sherman's success proved that Confederate resistance could be broken through persistent pressure and superior resources. The Democratic platform calling for an immediate armistice suddenly seemed both defeatist and unnecessary. Sherman's next decision shocked both his enemies and his supporters. Rather than pursuing Hood's retreating army, he proposed cutting loose from his supply lines and marching across Georgia to the sea. The plan violated every principle of conventional military strategy, but Sherman understood that destroying Confederate infrastructure and morale was more important than destroying Confederate armies. Grant initially opposed Sherman's march, preferring that he pursue Hood's army into Tennessee. But Sherman argued persuasively that Hood could be handled by other Union forces, while his march through Georgia would demonstrate Confederate powerlessness to protect their own territory. "I can make Georgia howl," Sherman promised, and Grant finally gave his approval for the unprecedented campaign. Sherman's march to the sea began on November 16, 1864, when his army of 62,000 men left Atlanta and disappeared into the Georgia countryside. For nearly a month, Northern newspapers had no word of Sherman's whereabouts, leading to speculation that his army had been destroyed by Confederate forces. In reality, Sherman was implementing a new form of warfare that targeted civilian support for the Confederate war effort. The march was not random destruction, but carefully planned psychological warfare. Sherman's soldiers destroyed railroads, burned military supplies, and confiscated livestock and food, but they generally avoided harming civilians directly. The goal was to demonstrate that the Confederate government could not protect its own people, thereby undermining civilian support for continued resistance. The march also had a profound impact on enslaved people throughout Georgia. As Sherman's columns advanced, thousands of former slaves joined the procession, seeing in the Union Army their path to freedom. The sight of these liberated people following Sherman's army provided powerful visual evidence that slavery was ending regardless of Confederate resistance. Sherman's army reached Savannah on December 10, 1864, and captured the city 11 days later. His telegram to Lincoln offering Savannah as a Christmas present became another iconic moment of the war. More importantly, the successful completion of the march proved that the Confederacy was helpless to prevent Union armies from operating wherever they chose. While Sherman was marching through Georgia, other Union forces were completing the destruction of Confederate power in Virginia. In the Shenandoah Valley, General Philip Sheridan was implementing Grant's orders to turn the region into a barren waste that could no longer support Confederate armies. Sheridan's campaign destroyed mills, barns, livestock, and crops throughout the valley, ensuring that it would never again serve as a Confederate granary. The Battle of Cedar Creek on October 19, 1864, marked the end of Confederate resistance in the Shenandoah Valley. Early's surprise attack initially routed Union forces, but Sheridan's dramatic arrival from Winchester rallied his troops for a counterattack that destroyed Early's army as an effective fighting force. Sheridan's ride from Winchester became the subject of a famous poem, but more importantly, it eliminated the last Confederate threat to Washington. By the end of 1864, the Confederacy was clearly losing the war. Sherman controlled Georgia and was preparing to march north through the Carolinas. Grant held Lee's army in the Petersburg trenches, slowly extending his lines and cutting Confederate supply routes. Confederate finances had collapsed with inflation, making their currency nearly worthless. Desertion rates climbed as soldiers received desperate letters from families facing starvation. Yet the Confederacy fought on, sustained by a combination of desperation and defiance that surprised even Union leaders. Jefferson Davis continued to speak of ultimate victory, while Lee's army maintained its fighting efficiency despite enormous hardships. Confederate civilians endured privations that would have broken earlier generations, keeping their faith in eventual independence, even as Union armies devastated their homeland. The reasons for this continued resistance were complex. Many Confederates genuinely believed they were fighting for liberty against tyranny, comparing themselves to the American revolutionaries who had won independence against seemingly impossible odds. Others were motivated by fear of what defeat might bring: racial equality, economic ruin, social revolution. Still others simply could not accept that their enormous sacrifices had been in vain. Lincoln understood that Confederate resistance would continue until their society was completely exhausted. In his second inaugural address, delivered on March 4, 1865, he spoke of the war's divine purpose, while acknowledging its terrible cost. "Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away," he declared. "Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether." The speech reflected Lincoln's evolution from a politician seeking to preserve the Union to a moral leader seeking to transform American society. The war had become more than a conflict between sections. It was a struggle to determine whether America would fulfill its founding promise that all men are created equal. Victory would require not just military triumph, but moral regeneration. As spring arrived in 1865, both armies in Virginia prepared for what everyone knew would be the final campaign. Lee's forces were reduced to fewer than 60,000 effective men, many of them barefoot and poorly fed. Grant commanded over 120,000 well-equipped soldiers, supported by ample supplies and reinforcements. The mathematical certainty of Confederate defeat was obvious to everyone except perhaps Lee himself. Yet Lee continued to seek the miracle that might save his cause. He planned a breakout attack against Fort Stedman, hoping to force Grant to contract his lines and create an opportunity for escape. The attack on March 25th achieved initial surprise, but ultimately failed when Union reinforcements contained the breakthrough. Lee's losses, nearly 5,000 men he could not afford to lose, brought him closer to the end he could no longer postpone. Grant's final offensive began on March 29, 1865, when Union forces moved to cut the last railroad lines supplying Petersburg. At Five Forks on April 1st, Sheridan's cavalry and infantry routed the Confederate force protecting Lee's right flank. The defeat severed Lee's last supply line and made the evacuation of Petersburg inevitable. On April 2nd, Grant ordered a general assault along the Petersburg lines. The attacks succeeded in multiple locations, forcing Lee to begin the evacuation he had postponed for nearly 10 months. Richmond fell the next day, as Confederate officials fled westward, leaving the capital in flames as retreating forces destroyed military supplies and facilities. Lee's retreat toward Lynchburg became a running battle as Union forces pursued from multiple directions. Confederate stragglers fell behind in increasing numbers, many simply too exhausted to continue. Supply wagons broke down on muddy roads, and Lee's army began to disintegrate even without direct enemy pressure. The end came at a small courthouse town called Appomattox. Lee's remaining forces, perhaps 28,000 men, found themselves surrounded by over 80,000 Union troops. A final breakout attempt on April 9th failed when Confederate forces encountered not just cavalry, but infantry and artillery blocking their escape route. Lee realized that further resistance would accomplish nothing except additional bloodshed. The surrender meeting between Lee and Grant at the McLean House in Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, marked the effective end of the Civil War. Grant's terms were generous. Confederate officers could keep their sidearms, soldiers could take their horses for spring plowing, and no one would be prosecuted for treason if they observed their paroles. Lee's dignity in defeat and Grant's magnanimity in victory set the tone for what both men hoped would be a peaceful reconstruction. As Lee rode back to his army for the last time, his soldiers broke ranks to touch his horse traveler or simply to see their beloved commander one final time. Many wept openly as Lee announced the army's surrender. These men had followed him through 4 years of incredible hardships and victories, and now their cause was lost forever. Yet Lee's final order emphasized duty and honor even in defeat, urging his men to be as good citizens as they had been soldiers. The war that had begun with romantic dreams of quick victory and minimal bloodshed had consumed over 620,000 American lives, more than all other American wars combined until Vietnam. Entire families had been wiped out, cities lay in ruins, and a generation of young men had perished in the conflict. The economic cost was equally staggering, with the national debt increasing from $65 million to over $2.7 billion. Yet the war had also transformed America in fundamental ways. Slavery was dead-killed not just by the Emancipation Proclamation, but by the actions of 4 million enslaved people who had seized their freedom when the opportunity arose. The federal government had proven it possessed the power to preserve the Union and enforce national law. Most importantly, America had been reborn with a new understanding of its founding principles. The question that remained was whether this transformation would survive the peace. Lincoln's assassination, just 5 days after Lee's surrender, removed the one leader who might have guided the nation through the difficult process of Reconstruction. The martyred president's vision of malice toward none, charity for all, would be tested by the bitter realities of rebuilding a shattered nation. But that is another story. The Civil War itself was over, and America emerged from the crucible fundamentally changed. The house divided against itself had been made whole again, not through compromise or accommodation, but through the terrible arithmetic of war. As you drift toward sleep, consider the profound truth that sometimes nations, like individuals, must endure great suffering to discover who they truly are. The guns had fallen silent at last, but their echoes would resonate through American history forever. The armies that had locked in deadly embrace for 4 years began the long journey home, carrying with them memories that would haunt their dreams for decades to come. Yet even as soldiers laid down their rifles and furled their battle flags, the war's most profound battles were just beginning. The conflict had settled the question of slavery and union with blood and iron, but it had created new questions that would challenge the nation's very soul. In the immediate aftermath of Appomattox, a strange quiet settled over the American landscape. The constant drumbeat of war news that had dominated newspapers for 4 years suddenly ceased. Families who had lived in daily dread of casualty lists could finally breathe freely. But the silence was deceptive. Beneath the surface, powerful forces were already stirring that would shape the next century of American life. Abraham Lincoln understood better than most that military victory was merely the first act of a much longer drama. The president who had guided the nation through its darkest hour now faced perhaps his greatest challenge: how to bind up the nation's wounds without abandoning the principles for which so much blood had been shed. The question of Reconstruction, literally rebuilding the Union, would test every lesson learned during 4 years of war. Lincoln's approach to Reconstruction reflected his characteristic blend of pragmatism and moral conviction. He had proposed the 10% plan as early as 1863, offering to readmit Confederate states when 10% of their 1860 voters took an oath of loyalty to the Union. This lenient approach horrified radical Republicans in Congress, who demanded harsher punishment for the South and stronger protections for newly freed slaves. The tension between mercy and justice that had characterized Lincoln's wartime leadership now threatened to tear apart the coalition that had won the war. Radical Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner argued that the Confederate states had committed suicide through secession and should be treated as conquered territories. They demanded land redistribution, harsh punishment for Confederate leaders, and immediate political rights for freed slaves. Conservative Republicans and war Democrats, by contrast, favored rapid restoration of the Union with minimal changes to Southern society beyond the abolition of slavery. They worried that harsh Reconstruction policies would drive the South into permanent opposition and make genuine reconciliation impossible. The debate revealed fundamental disagreements about the war's meaning and the peace that should follow. Lincoln's assassination on April 14, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender, transformed the entire landscape of Reconstruction. John Wilkes Booth's bullet not only killed the president, but shattered any hope for the kind of magnanimous peace Lincoln had envisioned. The martyred president's successor, Andrew Johnson, lacked both Lincoln's political skills and his moral authority to guide the nation through the turbulent years ahead. Johnson, a Tennessee Democrat who had remained loyal to the Union, initially appeared to support harsh measures against Confederate leaders. His early statements about making treason odious encouraged radical Republicans to believe they had found an ally. But Johnson's fundamental conservatism and his racism soon became apparent as he implemented Reconstruction policies that differed little from Lincoln's 10% plan. The new president moved quickly to restore civilian government in the former Confederate states, appointing provisional governors and calling for constitutional conventions. His only requirements were that the states ratify the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, repudiate Confederate debts, and declare secession null and void. By the end of 1865, all former Confederate states except Texas had met these minimal conditions and were seeking readmission to the Union. But the state governments that emerged under Johnson's Reconstruction bore an uncomfortable resemblance to their antebellum predecessors. Former Confederate leaders dominated the new legislatures, and many of the same men who had led the South into secession now sought to lead it back into the Union. Most ominously, these governments began enacting black codes that severely restricted the rights of freed slaves. The black codes varied from state to state, but shared common features designed to maintain white supremacy and ensure a continued supply of cheap agricultural labor. Freed slaves were required to sign annual labor contracts, forbidden to leave their employer's land without permission, and subject to arrest for vagrancy if they could not prove employment. Children could be apprenticed to their former masters if their parents were deemed unable to support them. In essence, the codes sought to create a system of quasi-slavery that would preserve the antebellum social order. Northern reaction to the black codes was swift and angry. Soldiers who had risked their lives to end slavery watched in dismay as their sacrifices were nullified by legal chicanery. Newspaper editorials denounced the codes as a betrayal of the war's meaning, while Republican politicians demanded federal intervention to protect the rights of freed slaves. The crisis deepened when the former Confederate states elected dozens of former Confederate officials to Congress, including the former Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens. Northern voters who had expected the South to show some contrition for the rebellion were outraged to see unrepentant rebels seeking to resume their seats in the halls of power they had recently tried to destroy. When Congress reconvened in December 1865, Republican leaders refused to seat the Southern delegations. Instead, they established the Joint Committee on Reconstruction to investigate conditions in the former Confederate states and develop new policies for readmission. The committee's hearings revealed shocking testimony about violence against freed slaves and white Unionists throughout the South. The testimony painted a picture of a region in chaos, where the end of slavery had unleashed forces of vengeance and resistance that threatened to drag the South back into civil war. Former slaves testified about midnight raids by white vigilantes, while white Unionists described being driven from their homes by neighbors who viewed them as traitors. The committee's reports convinced many moderate Republicans that Johnson's lenient policies had failed. The Freedmen's Bureau, established in the final weeks of the war, became a focal point of the Reconstruction struggle. Headed by General Oliver Howard, the Bureau was tasked with providing food, medical care, and education to former slaves while helping them transition to freedom. Bureau agents also tried to ensure fair labor contracts and protect freed people from violence and fraud. The Bureau's work revealed both the promise and the limitations of federal intervention in Southern society. Its schools brought literacy to thousands of former slaves who had been forbidden to read under slavery. Its hospitals treated diseases that had been ignored when black lives were considered property. Its courts provided a forum where black Americans could seek justice against white employers and landlords. Yet the Bureau also faced enormous challenges that exposed the inadequacy of Northern commitment to racial equality. It was chronically underfunded and understaffed, with fewer than 1,000 agents trying to serve 4 million freed slaves across the former Confederacy. Many agents were overwhelmed by the magnitude of their task, while others proved sympathetic to white Southern claims that freed slaves were lazy and needed firm guidance. The question of land redistribution became perhaps the most contentious issue of Reconstruction. Many freed slaves believed they had been promised land as compensation for their unpaid labor during slavery. General Sherman's Special Field Order 15, which had allocated abandoned Sea Island plantations to former slaves, seemed to confirm these expectations. 40 acres and a mule became the symbol of black hopes for economic independence. But President Johnson's pardoning of Confederate landowners led to the restoration of most confiscated property, dashing black hopes for land ownership. Without land, most freed slaves had little choice but to work for their former masters under sharecropping arrangements that kept them in perpetual debt and dependence. The failure to redistribute land ensured that economic power in the South would remain concentrated in white hands. The growing conflict between President Johnson and congressional Republicans came to a head in 1866 with the passage of the Civil Rights Act. This landmark legislation declared that all persons born in the United States were citizens regardless of race and guaranteed equal protection under the law. When Johnson vetoed the bill, arguing that it violated states' rights, Congress overrode his veto for the first time in American history on a major piece of legislation. The override marked the beginning of congressional Reconstruction, as Republican legislators took control of Reconstruction policy away from the president. To ensure that the Civil Rights Act could not be overturned by future Congresses or declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, Republicans drafted the 14th Amendment, which constitutionalized the principle of birthright citizenship and equal protection under the law. The 14th Amendment represented a revolutionary expansion of federal power and individual rights. Its Equal Protection Clause would become one of the most important provisions in the Constitution, eventually serving as the legal foundation for the civil rights movement of the 20th century. But in 1866, its immediate purpose was to protect the rights of freed slaves against hostile state governments. Johnson's opposition to the 14th Amendment led him to campaign actively against Republican candidates in the 1866 midterm elections. His speaking tour, known as the Swing Around the Circle, backfired spectacularly as the president engaged in undignified public arguments with hecklers. Race riots in Memphis and New Orleans, where white mobs attacked black communities with impunity, reinforced Republican arguments that stronger federal intervention was necessary. The 1866 elections gave Republicans overwhelming majorities in both houses of Congress, providing them with the power to override Johnson's vetoes at will. Emboldened by their mandate, Republican leaders passed the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, which divided the former Confederacy into 5 military districts under federal control. The acts required the Southern states to write new constitutions guaranteeing black male suffrage and to ratify the 14th Amendment before they could be readmitted to the Union. Military Reconstruction, as it came to be known, marked the most radical phase of the post-war settlement. For the first time in American history, the federal government used military force to guarantee civil rights for African Americans. Federal troops protected black voters from intimidation, while military commanders removed obstructionist state officials and supervised the election of new constitutional conventions. The constitutional conventions that met under military Reconstruction represented a dramatic departure from antebellum Southern politics. For the first time, black men participated as voters and delegates, making up majorities in several states. These conventions produced the most democratic constitutions in Southern history, establishing public school systems, guaranteeing civil rights, and modernizing state governments. Yet the new governments faced enormous challenges from the outset. They inherited bankrupt treasuries, devastated infrastructure, and hostile white populations determined to resist racial equality. The label Radical Reconstruction attached to these governments was misleading. Most were moderate coalitions trying to rebuild their states while protecting the rights of all citizens. The coalition that supported these new governments was diverse but fragile. It included freed slaves voting for the first time, white Southern Unionists who had opposed secession, and Northern migrants known derisively as carpetbaggers. Each group had different interests and priorities, making unified action difficult. Black voters generally supported education and civil rights measures, while white Republicans often prioritized economic development and reconciliation with former Confederates. The emergence of the Ku Klux Klan and other terrorist organizations posed an existential threat to Republican governments throughout the South. Founded in Tennessee in 1866, the Klan used violence and intimidation to suppress black political participation and terrorize white Republicans. Hooded night riders burned schools and churches, whipped and murdered political activists, and threatened anyone who challenged white supremacy. Klan violence reached epidemic proportions by 1870, effectively nullifying federal civil rights laws in many areas. President Ulysses Grant, who had succeeded Johnson in 1869, responded with the Force Acts, which authorized federal prosecution of Klan members and the use of military force to protect civil rights. The laws achieved some success in breaking up Klan organizations, but they could not address the underlying white hostility to racial equality. The economic challenges facing the post-war South were as daunting as the political ones. The war had destroyed much of the region's infrastructure, while the end of slavery had eliminated the labor system that had generated antebellum wealth. Cotton production, the foundation of the Southern economy, did not return to pre-war levels until the 1870s, and even then falling prices made farming less profitable than before. The crop-lien system that emerged during Reconstruction created new forms of economic bondage for both black and white farmers. Unable to obtain credit from banks, farmers mortgaged their future crops to merchants who charged exorbitant interest rates and required purchases from company stores at inflated prices. This system trapped farmers in cycles of debt that often proved impossible to escape. Sharecropping, meanwhile, became the dominant form of agricultural labor throughout the Cotton South. Former slaves and poor whites worked plots of land owned by others, sharing a portion of their crop as rent. While sharecropping provided more autonomy than wage labor, it also tied workers to the land and made them vulnerable to cheating by landowners who controlled the weighing and marketing of crops. The promise of education became one of Reconstruction's most significant achievements. Northern missionary societies and the Freedmen's Bureau established thousands of schools for former slaves, while the new state constitutions mandated public education for all children. Black communities demonstrated extraordinary hunger for learning, contributing their own labor and resources to build schools and pay teachers. The establishment of historically black colleges and universities during this period created institutions that would serve African American communities for generations. Schools like Fisk Howard and Atlanta University provided higher education opportunities that had been completely denied under slavery. These institutions produced the teachers, ministers, doctors, and lawyers who would lead black communities through the difficult decades ahead. Yet education also became a battleground in the struggle over Reconstruction. White Southerners resented taxes to support public schools and often violently opposed integrated education. Many black schools were burned by arsonists, while teachers faced threats and harassment. The promise of universal education would remain unfulfilled in much of the South for decades to come. Women's rights advocates had hoped that the war's revolutionary changes would extend to female suffrage, but they were disappointed by the 14th and 15th Amendments' focus on male citizenship and voting rights. The decision to prioritize black male suffrage over women's suffrage split the antebellum coalition of abolitionists and women's rights activists, creating divisions that would persist for decades. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony opposed the 15th Amendment because it enfranchised black men while continuing to exclude all women from voting. They argued that educated white women deserved the vote more than illiterate former slaves, revealing the racial prejudices that undermined potential alliances between women's rights and civil rights advocates. The growing tensions between President Johnson and congressional Republicans finally erupted in 1868 when the House of Representatives impeached Johnson for violating the Tenure of Office Act. The impeachment trial in the Senate became a constitutional crisis that tested the balance of power between the executive and legislative branches. Johnson survived conviction by a single vote, but his presidency was effectively ended. The election of Ulysses Grant as president in 1868 seemed to promise continued federal commitment to protecting black rights in the South. Grant had been the Union's greatest military hero, and his campaign slogan, "Let us have peace," appealed to war-weary voters. But Grant's presidency would be marked by corruption scandals and economic depression that weakened Republican support for Reconstruction policies. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, prohibited states from denying voting rights based on race color or previous condition of servitude. Its passage marked the high point of Reconstruction's promise guaranteeing constitutional protection for black political participation. Yet the amendment's loopholes, it did not prohibit literacy tests. Poll taxes or other devices designed to circumvent its protections would enable future disenfranchisement campaigns. By the early 1870s, signs of Reconstruction's decline were becoming apparent. Northern voters were growing tired of Southern problems and increasingly focused on economic issues closer to home. The Panic of 1873 triggered a severe economic depression that shifted public attention away from civil rights to unemployment and business failures. The Republican Party, torn between its commitment to black rights and its desire to expand beyond its sectional base, began retreating from aggressive enforcement of civil rights laws. The Supreme Court accelerated Reconstruction's demise through a series of decisions that gutted the 14th and 15th Amendments. In the slaughterhouse cases of 1873, The court distinguished between national and state citizenship, severely limiting federal power to protect civil rights. The court's decision in United States versus Cruikshank in 1876 made it nearly impossible to prosecute Klan violence under federal law. White supremacist organizations adapted to changing political conditions by abandoning the Klan's terrorist tactics in favor of more sophisticated methods of political control. The White League in Louisiana and the Red Shirts in South Carolina used legal intimidation and economic pressure to suppress black voting while maintaining a veneer of respectability. These organizations succeeded in redeeming most Southern states from Republican control by the mid-1870s. The disputed election of 1876 provided the final blow to Reconstruction. When neither Republican Rutherford Hayes nor Democrat Samuel Tilden won a clear Electoral College majority Congress, created a commission to resolve the crisis. The Compromise of 1877 awarded the presidency to Hayes in exchange for the withdrawal of federal troops from the South and the end of military reconstruction. The troops that had protected black voters and Republican governments quietly departed Southern capitals in April and May 1877, leaving African Americans to face white supremacist governments without federal protection. The last Reconstruction governments collapsed within months, replaced by democratic regimes committed to rolling back black political gains and establishing systems of racial segregation. The end of Reconstruction marked the beginning of what historians call the nadir of American race relations. Over the next 2 decades, Southern states systematically disenfranchised black voters through poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses. Jim Crow laws mandated racial segregation in virtually every aspect of public life, from schools and theaters to restaurants and cemeteries. The Supreme Court's decision in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 provided constitutional sanction for segregation by establishing the doctrine of separate but equal. The court's ruling that racial separation did not violate the 14th Amendment if facilities were equal ignored the obvious reality that segregated facilities were never equal and that segregation itself stamped black Americans with a badge of inferiority. Violence became the ultimate guarantor of white supremacy as lynching reached epidemic proportions in the 1890s. Black Americans who challenged the racial order or who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time faced torture and death at the hands of white mobs. These lynchings were often public spectacles attended by thousands of spectators with photographs sold as postcards to commemorate the events. The failure of Reconstruction had profound consequences that extended far beyond the South. The abandonment of black Americans to white supremacist rule normalized racial oppression and violence throughout the country. The constitutional principles established during Reconstruction lay dormant for decades, waiting for a new generation of civil rights activists to resurrect them in the 20th century. Yet Reconstruction's achievements should not be forgotten. For a brief moment in American history, the nation had attempted to create a genuinely multiracial democracy based on the principle of equality before the law. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments provided the constitutional foundation for the later civil rights movement, while institutions like Howard University and the Black Church nurtured the leadership that would eventually challenge Jim Crow. The freed slaves themselves demonstrated remarkable resilience in the face of betrayal and oppression. Despite being denied land, education, and political rights, they built communities, established institutions, and preserved their dignity under the most difficult circumstances. Their descendants would carry forward the struggle for equality that Reconstruction had begun but failed to complete. The memory of Reconstruction became itself a battleground in American culture. White Southerners created a mythology of redemption that portrayed Reconstruction as a period of corruption and misrule by ignorant former slaves and opportunistic carpetbaggers. This narrative, popularized in films like The Birth of a Nation and books like The Klansman, justified the overthrow of Reconstruction governments and the establishment of white supremacy. Only in the 20th century did historians begin to challenge this interpretation, revealing Reconstruction as a noble experiment in interracial democracy that was overthrown by violence and terrorism. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s drew inspiration from Reconstruction's example, while scholars like W.E.B. Du Bois and Eric Foner documented the period's genuine achievements and tragic failures. As the 19th century drew to a close, America had become a radically different nation from the one that had stumbled into civil war in 1861. The country that emerged from Reconstruction was more centralized, more industrial, and more ethnically diverse. The federal government possessed powers that would have been unimaginable before the war, while the Constitution had been fundamentally transformed by the Civil War amendments. Yet the promise of equality that had motivated the war remained unfulfilled. The new birth of freedom that Lincoln had proclaimed at Gettysburg would have to wait for future generations to achieve. The Civil War had ended slavery and preserved the Union, but it had not created the just society that abolitionists had envisioned. The soldiers who had marched off to war as boys returned as men forever changed by what they had witnessed and endured. They carried within them memories of comrades lost, of battles won, and lost, of a nation transformed through suffering. Some found peace in their memories, while others were haunted by nightmares that never fully faded. The veterans of both armies gradually found common ground in their shared experience of combat, even as the political issues that had divided them remained unresolved. Blue and gray reunions became popular in the late 19th century, with former enemies meeting on old battlefields to commemorate their mutual sacrifice. These reunions promoted reconciliation between the sections, while often ignoring the rights of African Americans, for whom the war had supposedly been fought. The Civil War had tested the proposition that government of the people, by the people, and for the people could survive in a world dominated by monarchies and aristocracies. The Union's victory proved that democratic institutions could endure even the severest trials, but it also revealed how difficult it was to extend democratic principles to all citizens, regardless of race. The war's economic consequences continued to shape American development for decades. The industrial capacity built to supply Union armies became the foundation for America's emergence as a global economic power. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, bound the nation together physically, while opening new opportunities for westward expansion. The banking and financial systems developed during the war provided the capital needed for rapid industrial growth. But the war also created new forms of inequality and exploitation. The robber barons who accumulated vast fortunes in the Gilded Age often traced their wealth to wartime contracts and investments. The same industrial system that had produced victory over the Confederacy now produced working conditions that reformers compared to slavery itself. The Civil War generation slowly passed from the scene, taking with them direct memories of the conflict that had defined their lives. The last Civil War veteran died in 1956, more than 90 years after Appomattox, but the war's legacy continued to shape American society. The Civil Rights Movement drew inspiration from the unfulfilled promises of Reconstruction, while debates over federal power and states' rights echoed arguments that had divided the nation in 1861. Today, more than 160 years after the war began, Americans continue to grapple with its meaning and legacy. The battlefields have become national parks, where millions of visitors seek to understand what happened on those sacred grounds. The causes and consequences of the conflict remain subjects of scholarly debate and popular fascination. Perhaps the war's greatest lesson is that democracy requires constant vigilance and commitment from each generation. The Union that Lincoln saved and the freedom that the war promised were not permanent achievements, but ongoing challenges that each generation must meet anew. The price of liberty, as the founders knew, is eternal vigilance. As you drift towards sleep, consider the profound truth that nations, like individuals, sometimes must endure great suffering to discover who they truly are. The America that emerged from the Civil War was not the same country that had entered it. It was a nation that had looked into the abyss of its own contradictions and somehow found the strength to choose the better angels of its nature. The guns fell silent long ago, but their echoes still resonate through the American story. In the end, perhaps that is the Civil War's greatest legacy, not the battles won or lost, but the reminder that the work of freedom is never finished, that each generation must take up the unfinished work that those who came before advanced so nobly, and that the survival of democratic ideals depends not on their perfection, but on the willingness of imperfect people to keep striving toward a more perfect union. Sleep now and dream of an America that was reborn in fire and blood, that emerged from its greatest trial not perfect, but purified not without sin, but committed to the long journey toward justice. The story of the Civil War is ultimately the story of America itself, a nation that could tear itself apart and somehow find the wisdom to put itself back together stronger and more united than before. The echoes of that great conflict would reverberate through the decades that followed, shaping not just the physical landscape of America, but the very soul of the nation. As the last veterans gathered for their final reunions, their weathered faces telling stories that words could never fully capture. A new America was emerging from the ashes of the old. The children who had hidden in cellars during Sherman's march through Georgia grew up to become captains of industry. The boys who had watched their fathers march away to war became the architects of a new industrial age. The former slaves who had tasted freedom for the first time during those tumultuous years became the foundation of communities that would endure through Jim Crow and beyond. But perhaps the most profound transformation was not in the laws or the economy, or even the politics of the nation. It was in the American character itself. The innocence that had characterized the early republic was gone forever, replaced by a harder wisdom born of suffering. Americans had learned that their ideals could be preserved, but only at a cost they had never imagined paying. The battlefields themselves became hallowed ground places where Americans could come to remember not just the dead, but the principles for which they had died. Gettysburg, Antietam, Shiloh, Fredericksburg. These names entered the American vocabulary as something more than geographical locations. They became symbols of sacrifice, courage, and the terrible price of national unity. Veterans from both sides found themselves bound together by experiences that civilians could never fully understand. They had seen the elephant, as they called it. They had witnessed the worst that human beings could do to one another, and somehow they had survived. In their twilight years, blue and gray uniforms mattered less than the shared knowledge of what it meant to face death for something greater than oneself. The widows and orphans created by the war carried their own burden of memory. Entire generations of women who had never expected to live without husbands found themselves raising children alone, running farms and businesses, creating new roles for themselves in a society that had been transformed by necessity. Their quiet heroism often went unrecorded, but it was no less real for being unsung. The freed slaves and their descendants faced perhaps the greatest challenge of all. They had been promised freedom, but found themselves trapped in new forms of bondage. They had been promised equality, but found themselves subjected to laws designed to maintain their subordination. Yet they persevered, building schools and churches, creating businesses and communities, keeping alive the dream of true equality, even when the rest of the nation seemed determined to abandon it. The Industrial Revolution that the war had accelerated continued to transform American life. The same organizational skills that had moved armies across vast distances now moved goods and people with unprecedented efficiency. The same technological innovation that had produced better weapons now produced better tools for peace. The same financial systems that had funded the war effort now funded the greatest economic expansion in human history. But industrialization brought its own conflicts. The same tensions between capital and labor that had existed before the war now emerged with new intensity. Workers who had served in the armies of democracy returned home to find themselves subject to new forms of hierarchy and control. The promise of equality that had motivated the war seemed to apply only to the political sphere, not to the economic relationships that increasingly dominated daily life. The westward expansion that had been interrupted by the war resumed with renewed vigor. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, made possible the settlement of vast territories that had previously been accessible only to the most adventurous pioneers. But this expansion came at a terrible cost to the native peoples who had inhabited these lands for millennia. The same military efficiency that had won the war was now turned against indigenous communities in a series of conflicts that would complete the tragedy of American expansion. The cities that had grown during the war continued to expand, drawing millions of immigrants from Europe and migrants from rural America. These urban centers became laboratories for new forms of social organization, new technologies, and new cultural expressions. But they also became sites of poverty, disease, and social conflict that challenged the democratic ideals for which the war had supposedly been fought. The Constitution, that had been tested by secession and strengthened by the Civil War amendments, now faced new challenges. How far did federal power extend? What were the limits of individual liberty? How could democratic institutions adapt to the realities of an industrial age? These questions would occupy political philosophers and practical politicians for generations to come. The memory of the war itself became a contested terrain. Northerners celebrated their victory and the preservation of the Union. Southerners mourned their defeat, but created a mythology of noble lost causes and heroic resistance. African Americans remembered the war as the beginning of freedom, even as that freedom remained incomplete. Each group interpreted the conflict through the lens of their own experience and their own hopes for the future. Literature and art began to grapple with the war's meaning in ways that went beyond simple celebration or condemnation. Walt Whitman's poetry captured both the horror and the nobility of the conflict. Ambrose Bierce's stories revealed the psychological toll of combat. Later generations of writers would continue to mine the war for insights into the human condition and the American character. The photographs that had brought the reality of war into American homes for the first time created a new visual vocabulary for understanding conflict and suffering. Matthew Brady's images of battlefield corpses shocked civilians who had romanticized war. Alexander Gardner's portraits of Lincoln showed a president aged beyond his years by the weight of command. These images became part of the national memory, shaping how future generations would understand what their ancestors had endured. The technological innovations, spurred by military necessity, found peaceful applications that transformed daily life. The telegraph networks built to coordinate military operations became the foundation for national communication systems. The medical advances developed to treat battlefield injuries improved civilian health care. The organizational methods used to supply vast armies were adapted to manage large corporations and government bureaucracies. But perhaps the war's most lasting legacy was its demonstration that American democracy could survive its greatest test. The Union had been preserved not through compromise or accommodation, but through the willingness of ordinary citizens to make extraordinary sacrifices for their principles. This example would inspire democratic movements around the world, and provide hope for future generations facing their own crises. The economic changes unleashed by the war continued to reshape American society for decades. The shift from an agricultural to an industrial economy accelerated during the conflict and never reversed. The financial innovations developed to fund the war effort created new forms of capital and credit that made possible unprecedented economic growth. The organizational skills developed to manage military logistics were applied to civilian enterprises on a scale previously unimaginable. Yet this economic transformation came with social costs that were not immediately apparent. The concentration of wealth that industrialization encouraged created new forms of inequality that challenged democratic ideals. The urbanization that accompanied industrial growth created social problems that traditional institutions seemed unable to address. The pace of change itself became a source of anxiety for people whose ancestors had lived in stable agricultural communities for generations. The political system that emerged from the war was fundamentally different from what had existed before. The federal government had demonstrated powers that few had imagined possible in 1860. The precedent of national action to protect individual rights had been established, even if it was not consistently applied. The idea that the Constitution could be amended to reflect changing social values had been proven through the addition of 3 new amendments in rapid succession. Religious institutions also grappled with the war's meaning and legacy. Churches that had split along sectional lines before the war struggled to reunite afterward. Theological questions about divine providence and human suffering took on new urgency in light of the conflict's enormous casualties. The social gospel movement that emerged in the late 19th century drew much of its inspiration from the war's demonstration that Christians could not remain neutral in the face of great moral evils. Education, too, was transformed by the war's legacy. The literacy required for military service had highlighted the need for better schools. The democratic ideals for which the war had been fought demanded an educated citizenry capable of self-governance. The industrial economy that emerged from the conflict required workers with new skills and knowledge. These pressures combined to create the first truly national commitment to public education. The role of women in American society was permanently altered by their wartime experiences. Women who had managed farms and businesses while men were away fighting proved their capability in roles previously reserved for men. Women who had served as nurses, spies, and even soldiers in some cases had demonstrated courage and competence that could not be ignored. The women's rights movement that emerged after the war drew much of its strength from these wartime precedents. The cultural impact of the war extended far beyond politics and economics. The shared experience of national trauma created new forms of American identity that transcended regional differences. The common sacrifice of the war years provided a foundation for national unity that would prove crucial in future crises. The values tested and refined by the conflict, liberty, equality, democracy, self-government, became more clearly defined and more deeply cherished. Science and technology advanced rapidly during and after the war, driven by both military necessity and the economic opportunities created by national unity. The research and development capabilities that had produced better weapons were redirected towards civilian purposes. The communication and transportation networks built for military purposes facilitated the exchange of ideas and innovations. The educational institutions, strengthened by wartime needs, became centers for scientific research and technological development. The international implications of the war were equally significant. European powers that had expected the American democratic experiment to fail were forced to reassess their assumptions. The preservation of the Union demonstrated that democratic institutions could survive severe internal challenges. The abolition of slavery removed a major source of international criticism and aligned American practice more closely with American ideals. Immigration patterns were also affected by the war's outcome. The preservation of the Union and the abolition of slavery made America more attractive to Europeans seeking freedom and opportunity. The industrial growth spurred by the war created demand for workers that could only be met through increased immigration. The democratic values strengthened by the conflict provided a welcoming ideology for newcomers seeking to build new lives. The environmental consequences of the war were less immediately apparent, but no less significant. The industrial mobilization required for victory accelerated the exploitation of natural resources and the development of technologies that would reshape the American landscape. The westward expansion that resumed after the war brought new pressures on ecosystems that had remained relatively undisturbed. The urban growth that accompanied industrialization created new forms of environmental degradation. As the 20th century approached, the generation that had lived through the Civil War began to pass from the scene. But their legacy lived on in the institutions they had strengthened, the precedents they had established, and the values they had refined through suffering. The America they left to their children and grandchildren was fundamentally different from the country they had inherited, shaped by the crucible of conflict into something both stronger and more just. The final lesson of the Civil War may be that freedom is not a destination, but a journey, not a possession, but a responsibility. Each generation must earn anew the liberties that previous generations have won. Each era must face its own tests of character and commitment. Each age must decide whether to advance the cause of human dignity or to allow it to falter through indifference or opposition. As dawn breaks over the battlefields where so many Americans died for their vision of what the nation could become, their sacrifice reminds us that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, that the work of democracy is never finished, and that the promise of equality must be renewed by each generation that claims the name American. Sleep now knowing that the story continues, that the dream endures, and that the better angels of our nature, once awakened by the thunder of cannon and the cries of the dying, remain forever part of the American soul, waiting to be called upon whenever the nation faces its darkest hours and must choose once again between its highest aspirations and its deepest fears.